Welcome, everyone. I'm Kimberly Charrington, and on behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS, I want to warmly welcome you to today's Huessy Seminar, and a special welcome to today's featured guest, Rose Gottemoeller. During today's presentation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the chat at any time. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our host for today's seminar, Mr. Peter Huessy, President and Senior Director for Strategic Deterrence Studies at Geostrategic Analysis and Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and I want to welcome all our guests today, and particularly our speaker. Rose Gottemoeller is the William J. Perry Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Institute for International Studies and the Center for International Security and Cooperation. Before joining Stanford, Rose was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2016 to 2019. And prior to joining NATO, she served in the U.S. State Department as Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. And in 2009 and 2010, she was the chief negotiator for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, which the United States signed in 2010 with the Russian Federation. And her experience and her knowledge about this, you can read in her memoir, Negotiating the New START Treaty, published in 2021 by Cambria Press. I'm only in chapter number 2, Rose, but I'll get through it. But anyway, welcome on behalf of NIDS coming here to talk with us, because this is still, I think, a very, very important issue. And as you know, successful arms control, the framework has to be laid many years prior to inking the document, even if you go there. And so we're very excited to have you here. Thank you for joining us from the West Coast, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It is a true pleasure to be here, and I really encourage everyone. This book of mine, Negotiating the New START Treaty, makes terrific beach reading, so I highly endorse it for your vacation time this year. Actually, I tried to write it in a combination way, that is, make it an expert description of the negotiations, but also tell some vignettes and tell some history and stories. So I hope it makes for at least somewhat interesting reading. But in any event, thank you again very much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to this audience today. I'd like to talk about my thinking since I published this Foreign Affairs article in mid-April. Many of you may have seen it, the one entitled Arms Control is Not Dead Yet. And my thinking has advanced over the last couple of months, so I wanted to present some ideas to you today and get your questions and reactions. It's going to help me to sharpen my arguments and perhaps adapt them as well. And you all might be surprised that I am not gunning for an extension of the New START Treaty, but I am not. My reason is simple. The next treaty has to be wholly owned by Donald Trump if it is to be successful. Only he will have the power and influence to ensure that it will succeed in gaining the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate to his ratification signature. And I do stress that I think it should be a treaty, and I think this president can get one. Furthermore, only he can work successfully with Vladimir Putin to get what the United States needs out of the treaty, assuming that their current impasse over Russia's invasion of Ukraine can either be set aside for the negotiations or overtaken by a successful peace process, which would be the best outcome for the Ukrainians and everyone else, including the Russians, although I don't expect to see that as quickly as we may have hoped at the start of the Trump administration. In any event, I do think that it is possible to move forward on negotiating an arms control deal, even if we are continuing with this impasse in other ways with the Russians. That is not to say that elements of New START cannot play a role in the new treaty. Prior to Putin's decision in February 2023 to seize implementation of New START, halting on-site inspections and other verification activities, the treaty had proven itself fit for purpose, engaging or enabling either side to be sure that the other was implementing it. For that reason, I would argue that the essential superstructure of the verification regime can be maintained with some vital add-ons that I'll come to in a moment. But the inspections, the notifications, the data exchanges, the rules about not interfering with national technical means, that is, our satellites and other detection technologies, these all should be maintained intact. That will greatly simplify negotiation of a new treaty. Another vital element to consider is the central limits of New START: 1,550 deployed warheads, 700 deployed delivery vehicles, and 800 deployed and non-deployed launchers. I know there is a strong urge in some quarters to abandon these limits and begin to increase U.S. nuclear deployments in order to counter the Chinese nuclear modernization and the specter of two nuclear peers. However, as I argued in the Foreign Affairs piece, we do not need to panic over this problem in the next decade. And we should focus on completing our own modernization while watching carefully what both the Chinese and Russians are up to. Our program of record for modernizing the triad is already suffering delays and cost overruns. We need to keep our eye on that prize and not allow ourselves to be distracted by new nuclear requirements that will exacerbate the problems that we already have. Moreover, we need to keep the Russians from sprinting away from us as we complete our triad modernization. Their own modernization is already complete, and they could use their upload capacity to quickly build up deployed warhead numbers beyond 1,550. In that case, we would be struggling to modernize the triad, as well as counter their upload campaign, meanwhile watching the ongoing Chinese buildup. We can address this potential challenge from the Russians by keeping them within New START limits for the time being. With the Chinese, we need a different approach. And again, I talked about this in the Foreign Affairs article. We need an approach that focuses on getting them to the negotiating table and selling them on the value of predictability in our nuclear relationship. Their warhead numbers, at approximately 600 total, are still small compared to ours, nearly 4,000 total, but they are growing rapidly. They will reach 1,500 total by 2035, according to the U.S. Department of Defense. Why? How can they possibly maintain that they are still focused on no first use as a strategy in the midst of such a buildup, which also includes delivery vehicles and launchers? We need to get answers to these questions as we update them on our own plans for the future of our nuclear deterrent forces. In short, with the Chinese, it is all about nuclear predictability. With the Russians, it is all about sustaining nuclear limits. In each case, the predictability and limits must be mutual, us and them, to make them viable. But the two should not be at the same negotiating table because the numbers with Beijing are too disparate, and the parity relationship still holds between Moscow and Washington. We need to keep it that way for our own good and the good of our nuclear triad modernization. That is not to say that we ignore the necessity of getting some preliminary constraints out of the Chinese. The most basic, if the United States and Russia agree on maintaining the limits of New START, is that China should agree not to undermine the limits of New START by rushing to parity with the United States. We can also talk with them about a ban on nuclear weapons deployed on orbit, whether on a fractional orbital bombardment system, a FOB system, or a satellite. Obviously, this is a banned proposal to introduce to the Russians as well. We can succeed at two parallel negotiations, carefully crafted to get what we need out of them. As must always be the case, U.S. national security interests must be front and center as we judge how best to deal with the nuclear threats from China and Russia. With Russia, the superstructure and central limits of New START are still fit for purpose, in my view, but new ideas are needed to address the long-standing U.S. concern about a preponderance of Russian non-strategic nuclear warheads. Here, President Trump, in his first administration, introduced an important innovation. He got President Putin to agree in 2019 to a freeze on all nuclear warheads, deployed and non-deployed, strategic and non-strategic. If Mr. Trump reintroduces this proposal in his new treaty, it will be an important step toward constraining Russian non-strategic warheads, for it will open the door to negotiating direct limits on warheads. As many of you know, up to this point, nuclear treaties have only controlled warheads indirectly through limitations and reductions in their delivery vehicles. Implementation of a freeze will allow frank consideration of warhead monitoring and verification, which will be vital to the success of future warhead constraints. And with some new technological developments and some new thinking that has gone on this matter, I am convinced that we can have an effective and useful warhead monitoring and verification regime. Other innovations might include a freeze on deploying new types and new kinds of missiles for the duration of the treaty, which would begin to constrain the Russian exotic systems, such as nuclear-propelled sea-based missiles. These are the ones that Putin has been showing off in recent years. In addition, we should consider a ban on upload for the duration of the treaty, again to put the brakes on the Russian capability to quickly increase warhead deployments. As to the duration, I would argue for 10 years, which would take us to the mid-2030s and the completion, or at least nearly so, of our triad modernization. Our main goal should be to sustain a stable environment while the program of record is being achieved. We should also consider whether it should be 10 years renewable upon review of the US, Russian, and Chinese modernization programs, the status of the UK and French nuclear forces, and the nuclear nonproliferation regime as a whole might also be factored into a renewal decision. Now, here I want to turn to an important topic newly on the table, although it's been historically quite often on the table. Missile defense will have to enter into our considerations. It was front and center as an issue in negotiation of the New START Treaty, and I have the scars to show for it. With President Trump's new Golden Dome proposal for a comprehensive defense of the United States, one might expect Moscow again to raise the issue in spades. However, I am wondering, the war in Ukraine has made it evident to all parties, including NATO allies, that integrated air and missile defenses are necessary to address the explosive proliferation of drones and missiles, including shorter range and air-breathing systems, based on land, at sea, and in the air. Is Russia, or China for that matter, really going to say that none of us should work on integrated air and missile defense for our homelands? They indeed will be doing so themselves. Here I think we need a new discussion of what it means to undermine the strategic offensive deterrence of the great nuclear powers. Can we develop judicious defenses against shorter and intermediate range missiles, including air breathers, while sustaining the effectiveness of our central strategic forces? I don't have a complete answer to this question, but I think that it deserves a serious discussion among our expert communities, but also with our foreign counterparts, so that we all develop an understanding of what this revolution in missile and drone capability means for the viability of offensive nuclear deterrence at the strategic level. To my mind, such a discussion should be of interest and should be an inherent part of parallel negotiations with Moscow and Beijing. But we may also want to open it up to the other nuclear powers. Certainly India and Pakistan have missile proliferation to contend with, as do the European nuclear powers, the United Kingdom and France. Perhaps talks among the P5 nuclear weapon states could include India and Pakistan to discuss how to balance wide-ranging missile proliferation with the requirement for integrated air and missile defenses and the need to maintain stable strategic nuclear deterrence. Again, with this audience, I would very much welcome your comments and your views on this matter, but I do think it is important that we consider this burst in proliferation of missiles as we proceed forward on the matter of further nuclear arms control. We are clearly entering into unknown territory on so many strategic and technological issues. It behooves all of us to make the best use of what is still useful from the past, and that is aspects of the New START Treaty, but also be willing to tackle new issues. With the willingness that Mr. Trump has already shown in his first administration to take on the issue of constraining warheads, we have the opportunity to forge into new territory on nuclear arms control. We also have to be mindful of new developments, such as intensive missile proliferation, and be ready to confront them in new ways. If none of us wants to do without missile defenses, then how do we sustain our strategic offensive deterrence over time? And I have not even raised whether artificial intelligence and quantum technologies will impact nuclear deterrence. I am convinced that they will. Many of you will know my article in the Texas National Security Review of several years ago. But that is a topic for another discussion. However, I'm willing to talk about it today if you're interested. But I've been focused on this more immediate set of issues. That is, for now, let's think what makes most sense in the immediate period for the control of nuclear weapons, for our sake, for the sake of our nuclear modernization program, our program of record, but also for the future of global stability and security. With that, I very much look forward to our conversation this morning, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rose, very much. Let me ask you a couple questions that Frank Miller and Ambassador Edelman raised in remarks just a couple days ago. They're going to be speaking to our group on August 1st. And there were two issues they raised that why they thought we shouldn't, it would not be right to extend New START. But they said two things. One, an arms control limit of, let's say, 1,500 warheads or 1,000 warheads doesn't necessarily equate with what we need for deterrence, particularly given the China's 300 plus missile silos, that if you believe in counterforce deterrence, then you have to hold them at rest. The second issue they raised, which you have addressed in part, is any number has to deal with theater weapons according to the Senate ratification of New START. And that's a very tough thing to do because of verification issues. You touched on that, but could you address those two issues?
Absolutely. And again, I think that Eric and Frank and I differ only on certain aspects. And the aspect that I really want to emphasize here is the notion that I feel is all important. And that is, well, there are two issues I think we need to tackle here. First is that we can see the Chinese modernization coming, right? But they are still far from being a pure competitor. And our own Department of Defense is saying that they are not going to acquire 1,500 total warheads until 2035. We have time to work this problem. And that's why I keep emphasizing we do not need to panic. We need to be ready to handle it. And I would argue that everything we do to achieve our program of record, building up our delivery vehicles, modernizing them, and our ability to produce warhead pits, our ability to refurbish more quickly our warheads and modernize that aspect as well. Everything we do in the next 10 years prepares us if we need to tackle the notion of two nuclear peers at once, which is, everybody recognizes, a worst case scenario that we have to tackle and we have to be prepared for. But I'd argue that the best way to prepare for that is to keep limitations in place for the time being and that predictability in place, first and foremost, to complete our program of record and get that done and prepare ourselves in case we must address this worst case. But I would argue that that is 10 years out. And not only because the Chinese will have 1,500 warheads total, but also because we will have during that period, unless somehow we make the decision, which I don't think we're going to make, to rapidly eliminate further warheads, we will sustain our own upload capacity and capability in these 10 years. And with the modernization of our delivery vehicles, we can modernize for more efficacious, faster upload than we can dreaming about at the moment, uploading the Minuteman Force, for example, where, oh my gosh, those missiles are already obsolete, and trying to tackle upload adds expense, adds complexity, adds delays into our program of record, delays to the Sentinel program. We don't want to see any further delays to the Sentinel program. So that's my argument. We have some time to work this problem, and meanwhile, we need to keep our eye on the prize of achieving the program of record and preparing ourselves for the worst case. But we don't need to panic, because even in 2035, if the Chinese have a total of 1,500 warheads, if we prepare ourselves to upload rapidly with our new SLBMs, our new ICBMs, then we can be ready to address that issue and do so in a way that we would sprint away from the Chinese. So I think that's how I think about the problem. And it's worth argumentation. It's worth further discussion. I totally think this is a vital debate to have at this point. So I very much welcome what Frank and Erica put on the table. But let's try to think about it in terms of, is there an opportunity in the next 10 years to get these guys to the negotiating table and to negotiate some predictability into our relationships and lower numbers, perhaps? Let us see if we can achieve that. And if not, if we have to address the worst case, we will be ready to do so in 2035. And by the way, that has to be a vital aspect of our message to the Chinese and Russians as well. So that's the first point. On monitoring and verification, I mentioned that a huge amount of work has been done in recent years, and some of you are aware of the work that has been done in partnership with a nuclear threat initiative on a global basis to think about nuclear warhead verification. In addition to which, there are some interesting new approaches that have been developed. I've been part of a project with the Monterey Institute of International Studies and Stanford University. We really made use of our cryptographers at Stanford to develop new means of essentially tracking and exchanging sensitive information about warheads using cryptographic techniques. And so I think there's a whole lot of really interesting ideas out there that we can begin to pull together now in a practical way to improve our ability to monitor and verify warhead constraints. And in addition to which, we now have a baseline because of the reentry vehicle on-site inspections that we did under New START, which, as you know, we dispense with counting rules in New START and actually confirmed the numbers of warheads on the front end of missiles through our reentry vehicle on-site inspections in New START. So that gives us now also an experiential base in trying to look at the issue of warhead monitoring per se.
Our president, Jim Petrosky, who's joining us today, has a question, Rose. He says, how do we keep Russia at New START numbers when we currently do not have verification and inspections that have been suspended by Moscow?
Well, absolutely, that has to be one of the early points that President Trump makes to President Putin, that we must get back to the inspection regime and the total verification regime of New START, all of the implementation measures I mentioned in my remarks, on-site inspection, but also regularized notifications. We were exchanging regular notifications about the status of our nuclear delivery vehicles throughout the implementation of New START until February of 2023, and a regularized data exchange as well. So my view is that has to be part of the negotiation, but I really believe that will be an important aspect of the Russians showing good faith in proceeding with a new negotiation.
When I hosted a recent triad symposium down at Louisiana State University, and the foreign policy advisor to the head of U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command came and spoke to us. And the session we had was, what are our allies' view of arms control, both in Asia and in Europe? We had Steve Blank, a good friend of ours and a NIDS fellow, spoke about Russia. And then we had a gentleman from the Global Strike talk about. My question to you is, since you were Deputy Secretary General of NATO, what are the European attitudes towards nuclear arms control in terms of what would they like to see done, and what do you think their current attitude is of where we ought to be going?
Yeah,
I know Europe's a big place, but I figured you could go wherever you want on that, whether it's the French and British, who are nuclear powers themselves, versus Germany and others that are not nuclear powers.
Right. Well, it's very interesting. We did have the dreadful situation, as you know, of the Russians violating the INF Treaty and leading to the withdrawal of the United States in 2019. And I was at NATO throughout that period. And as Undersecretary prior to that time, I had been trying to get the Russians to own up to their violation of the INF Treaty and to work with us on resolving the violation issue. So it's a problem that I'm well acquainted with, and it woke up the European NATO allies, to be honest, to the importance of them paying attention to nuclear arms control matters. Because prior to that time, for them, this was something that the USSR, US and Russia did I think from the initial dual track decision and the INF negotiations back in the 1980s, after that period, they just weren't paying attention, and it was kind of something they tried to keep off their plate. But the Russian violation of INF, I think, brought it back front and center. To my mind, it was a bad thing that the Russians violated the treaty and the U.S. had to withdraw. But it was a good thing that it woke up the European NATO allies, as well as our Asian allies, frankly, to the importance of thinking about missile constraints and how to go about it. That's not a discussion we have had today, but my thinking is, frankly, that we need to be looking at an overarching ban on short and intermediate range missiles that are nuclear armed. Let the conventional ones run free, preserve the conventional missions for all these drones and shorter range systems and intermediate range systems, but ban nuclear warheads on them. I think that would be a good thing for everybody. And again, we can have a discussion of this, but I think, frankly, at this point, the NATO European allies would be ready to work with us on such a ban, because we had, again, an extensive and very intensive discussion with them through this Monterey Institute of International Studies project over the past 5 years. And the report that we came up with is described, all the measures that we talked about is described in a report called Everything Counts. And you can get it on the MEIS website, the Monterey Institute for International Studies. Everything Counts, talking about warhead constraints of this kind. And the European NATO allies came right along with us as we were working this project. And I was frankly impressed, because even 5-6 years ago, as I was NATO DSG, they were kind of waking up to the necessity that they pay more attention. But it was kind of like, oh no, this is not something we really want to be involved in. You guys do it. You Americans do it. But now, and also I think the way the Trump administration has been asking them to take more responsibility for their own defense, I think that will only reemphasize the necessity of them paying attention in the arms control arena if it comes to some new negotiations. So we will see. At the moment, I think the priority has to be on thinking about what to do about New START, which goes out of force in February of 2026. But I think, a ban on missiles in those shorter and intermediate ranges that are nuclear armed, I stress nuclear armed, preserve the conventional missions, but think about constraining the nuclear armed systems.
Thank you, Rose. Question from Dana Struckman, who's with the Naval War College. She says, what do you think would bring China to the negotiating table? Presently, they show no interest in arms control. So under what conditions do you think they would enter into an arms control treaty with necessary verification and other protocols?
Yeah, this is I would say, well understood talking point in Washington, is that the Chinese simply don't want to come to the negotiating table. So this is now a hypothesis we need to test. We clearly need to test. And President Trump, once again, has said that he wants to negotiate a deal not only with Putin, but also a deal with Xi Jinping. My own opinion is, and again, push back if you like, but my own opinion is that in his first administration, the Trump team did the wrong thing in trying to shoehorn the Chinese into a follow-on negotiation for New START. Their numbers are just too disparate, as I said in my own remarks. Still, only 600 warheads at the moment, and not all of those deployed. Again, I grant you they are building up rapidly and modernizing, and so please don't misunderstand me. I see that worst case coming at us. But at the moment, they are not there. And to try to say that they should enter into what is essentially a parity relationship with the United States and Russian Federation, to my mind, was a way to send them screaming from the negotiating table, which is essentially what happened. I think it has caused them to react and to be anxious about this matter. However, I will say, and my evidence is really based on a number of intensive track 2 engagements I've had with them. With high level, again, retired diplomats. Yes, it's not a track 1.5, but the messages that have been coming at us in these track 2s is, first of all, they're ready to talk about nuclear risk reduction. They're ready to talk about ways that we can try to keep the risks of nuclear escalation out of crisis to a minimum. And that is a new development in my experience. And second of all, they are ready in some regard to start talking to us about the objectives of their nuclear modernization. Even a year ago, they were stiff-arming us on this set of issues and saying it's all about building wind farms in those deserts north and west of Beijing. And we said, no,
Right.
we know they're not wind farms, they're silos. So what are you guys up to? But they were stiff-arming us. And just really in the last, I would say, 9 months or so, they've begun to talk about their nuclear modernization as being about bolstering the reliability and effectiveness of their second strike deterrence capabilities, their retaliatory forces. So we need to question that, as I said in my remarks. If this is all about retaliatory forces, why do you have to build up to such numbers? Let's talk about that. So we don't have to accept their argument. All I'm saying is that they are beginning to articulate a rationale now, which we should probe and question and really get them. Doing this in track 2 is fine, but we need to get them to a track 1.5 table and then begin also talking in track 1 settings, in my view. But I would do it on a bilateral basis with the Chinese and not try to shoehorn them into talks with the Russians, because again, I think that will lead to a mighty allergic reaction.
No, I would agree with you there. We have a question here that's quite interesting, given the recent conflict between Pakistan and India, where they started lobbing rockets at each other. Do you have any sense as to what would enable us to have India and Pakistan to sit down and maybe do arms control between the two of them, including maybe transparency, but so that the numbers, they know about each other's numbers and they keep it at a capped level, and whether they reduce or not, I'm not sure, but is there a place we can go there?
It's a very interesting question, Peter, and I actually have had some experience with this, because when I was Undersecretary of State back, it's about 15 years ago now, about 2010, 2011, so a little less than 15 years, we had been really beating our heads against the wall in the Conference on Disarmament. Again, the disarmament machinery of the United Nations is a mess right now, but we had been beating our head against the wall to try to get a discussion of a fissile material cutoff treaty going, and the Pakistanis were standing in the way, and other countries were hiding behind them, but we just could not get any kind of discussion going in the CD of a fissile material cutoff treaty. So I, at that point, convened what we called the P5+2. So the P5 plus India and Pakistan. It had a very limited agenda, just to try to talk about what it would take to get through the impasse at the CD on a fissile material cutoff treaty. And they were baby steps, believe me, because frankly, those two countries, Pakistan and India, were very chary. They were very nervous about being even though they loved being at the big table with the nuclear P5, they also were very chary about each other, being seen talking with each other in that context, and also then being seen talking with the P5 in that setting, where they have particular sponsor-client relationships, the Pakistanis with the Chinese, the Indians more with the Russians, historically anyway. So it lasted for about a year. We had about 4 meetings, and then it fell apart. I won't say who walked away from the table, but anyway, we couldn't keep it going. But we have had some experience, and I frankly think for a particular issue, like the issue, as I mentioned, of missile defenses, and whether there is a way to think about integrated air and missile defense for CONUS and for our other homelands without completely undermining the coherence and stability of our strategic offensive deterrent forces. I think that's a conversation everybody might be willing to have in that kind of setting. But where it's more of a bilateral issue, as your questioner is asking about, between India and Pakistan, I think they're going to react badly to the kind of idea of the United States or any of the other P5 marching in and saying, you guys sit down and talk. So I have a hard time thinking about how that would work, but it's worth considering. And I have to admit, I'm not an expert on South Asia. I've spent a lot of diplomatic time trying to work with both Delhi and Islamabad, but I'm not an expert on South Asia. So I think others might have some different points of view, and I'd certainly be glad to hear them.
We're gonna have Henry Sokolsky come and talk to us soon, and he's going to be talking about new rules and changed rules for the NPT. And in particular, because of what's going on with respect to Iran, question about North Korea, is that horse already out of the barn and not to be brought back? That's a tough one. But I wanted to ask you, what would you do to strengthen the NPT? And part of what Henry is concerned about is that some of our allies have enriched uranium beyond the level needed to have nuclear energy. And we kind of wink at it. I wrote a piece just recently called "The Great Nuclear Wink," and
that was an interesting piece. I saw it.
So the question then is, we have our good guys and we have the bad guys, and the question is, arms control assumes everybody gets treated the same, and the question is, if country X that happens to be somewhere in the Western Pacific has nuclear material enriched beyond 3.5%, I don't lose sleep over it, as opposed to someone like North Korea. So what would you suggest? I don't want to steal Henry's thunder, but what would you suggest, if anything, that we might do to try to strengthen the NPT?
Yeah, I should, I'll sign up for Henry's seminar if I can make it, because this is an issue that has been really staring at me too, and I frankly am quite concerned about the fact that the NPT, the whole review cycle, has become very routinized, and we're scraping along on the same set of issues and fighting over issues like Middle East weapons mass destruction free zone. Very important issue, and it's related to the question you asked me, Peter, because of course some of the Arab states are interested in acquiring their own enrichment capability now. So yeah, how exactly are we going to think about ensuring that the NPT remains fit for purpose, which I continue to assume is important, that we want to minimize the number of countries acquiring nuclear weapons, that we want to continue to hamper and minimize and prevent nuclear proliferation in every way we can, and the NPT has been a successful instrument to do so. But at the moment, its edges are looking very ragged, and meanwhile, in a way, we're fiddling while Rome burns, arguing over issues and arguing over whether or not we get a consensus document at the end, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I'm going to answer your question in a way as a kind of process thing, that I wish we could break out of the pattern we're in of certain fights that always have to happen, and certain fights that always lead to people leaving the review conference and saying, oh, it failed. Can we get into a process that is more effective at actually working these issues at a time when many changes are and will be occurring, because we want to see the emergence, at least I do, of the peaceful uses pillar as way more important than it has been in the past, because we want to see the advent of nuclear power expansion. We want to see more nuclear power use around the world, nuclear energy as a way both for clean energy, but also to supply the massive electricity needs we're going to have in the future for data centers and so forth. So there's a very important strategic objective out there, the expansion of nuclear power. And the NPT system should be able to facilitate that and help us to have predictable and reliable, safeguarded expansion of nuclear power. And we need to preserve that. But at the same time, that means that we are going to have to continue to work on achieving objectives under the disarmament pillar of the NPT. We can't abandon it. That's another reason why it's going to be important to think about, in my view, replacing New START and thinking about at least keeping some limitations. Even if we can not at the moment reduce weapons further, we need to keep some limitations in place. And we need to work also on the non-proliferation pillar of the NPT and make sure that countries understand those responsibilities to participate in the safeguards agreements, in the safeguards regime. So I don't have a good answer for you, except to say I would say to all the states parties, members of the NPT, let's get down to business here. We've really got an important agenda, that is expansion of nuclear power. How do we go about it? And if it means that the nuclear weapon states have to do some heavy lifting too, gosh, we should be ready to do so.
We had an interesting comment, and I wanted to share it with you, Rose, because when I was an undergraduate major in international affairs and lived in Korea and Japan for 2 years of study, one of my professors said, "Don't decide to concentrate on the South Asia, because someone came in and said, think of the nastiest divorce you can, and then give both sides nuclear weapons." Which was kind of on my way back from Japan, believe it or not, I stopped in Gangapur, India, where a professor of mine from my college here in America was doing an ethnography that he had done during partition, and he was going to update it. And it was fascinating to the different cultures between Korea and Japan, and India. But this leads to this question here, which is, someone wrote in and said, what are the gaps in arms control research that we need to address? And particularly, he thinks about improving our understanding of China's perspective on these issues. But I would expand that and say, what are the gaps in arms control research that we ought to go look at?
That's an excellent question. I'm not going to particularly refer to the South Asian conundrum, because it is a serious one and a serious crisis. But as I referred to a few moments ago, I'm not a particular expert on South Asia, aside from talking to them for many, many years about working more closely together to try to improve their mutual ability to address crisis and address the potential for nuclear escalation out of crisis. You know, to be honest with you, the most effectiveness we achieved in that arena, at least in my experience, and so I'm really banking on your understanding here, that was my experience working during the Obama administration, when President Obama was convening these nuclear security summits. And he convened, I think there were 3 or 4, forgive me for not remembering, but definitely there were 3. And he got the Indian and Pakistani leaders to come and participate in those nuclear security summits, where they were doing tabletop, like scenario-based discussions of nuclear escalation and nuclear risks. And I think that was, to my mind, it took a tremendous amount of diplomatic heavy lifting, but it was an effective way to get them involved in a multilateral discussion at the highest level of crisis prevention, escalation prevention, and so forth. And it also led to them being willing to assume some responsibility for nuclear security in their own systems. Some of you might be aware that the Pakistanis, for example, built a nuclear security institute, a nuclear security center, and they've made it available to the United Nations for regional training on nuclear security. So they began themselves to start to take some responsibility. So maybe that's a door we need to think about going through some more with the Indians and the Pakistanis, focusing on nuclear security, what we used to call material protection control and accounting, secure handling and transport, those kinds of things, as a door to develop a richer discussion with them on these important matters. So that's one point I'll make. But the other point, as I said at the end of my remarks, we haven't even talked today about the risks of the new and emerging technologies. I mentioned artificial intelligence and quantum technologies for the coherence and stability and future effectiveness of our nuclear offensive forces. But also, I think there are many, many opportunities there to improve our ability. we had an earlier question. Oh, Frank and Eric questioning the ability to really monitor and verify warhead constraints going forward. But these new technologies are going to give us some really, I think, amazing tools for change detection, in particular, change detection at nuclear storage and maintenance sites. That's just one example of how we will be able to be alerted to perhaps illicit activity in terms of loading warheads in particular, crisis scenarios or whatever. I think we have opportunities that come from these new and emerging technologies. And to my mind, that is a really important place for our expert community, our research community to put some attention now. How can these new and emerging technologies help us to do better monitoring and verification of arms control treaties and agreements? It's going to be, I think, vital for our nuclear agenda, but going forward also when we, I hope, get to a peace process between the Russians and Ukrainians, to think about the future of the European security architecture and the role of conventional predictability and confidence measures in that setting. The Vienna document, is hardly going to be fit for purpose in that setting, but can we use some of these new technologies to help us to enhance our ability to do conventional predictability and confidence building as well? So I think there is an area where I would very much welcome wide-ranging expert advice and expert engagement and involvement for. Let's look at the opportunities as well as the risks of some of these new technologies that seem pretty scary sometimes.
Rose, what if the president said to a group of nuclear experts, left and right, and said, give me a list of things that we need to make transparent, particularly among call it the top 5, add in other nuclear powers, but you go where you want with this. What are the transparency things that we need to have done and that are possible to get done? Because there's a difference between, boy, it would be nice, but I found in the study I did with Rick Fisher on China's attitudes about nuclear everything, is that transparency is not in their vocabulary. And it's almost as if they're afraid that if they tell us what they're doing, that we will draw the wrong conclusion. And my view is we're very open in America. I mean, you can read the congressional record and committee hearing record, and you know pretty much how much we have and where. And the question is, is this a pipe dream, or is it something a president should pursue?
Yeah, I don't think we should give up. For one thing, it is going to be important. Again, they are allergic to the word transparency. Yes, they are allergic to that word. I've got the scars to show for it. But they do seem interested increasingly in talking about mutual predictability. So, okay. And in that way, I think that, again, we start with some baby steps, but baby steps that are foundational for future arms control treaties and agreements. We had, as many of you know, for the past nearly 20 years at this point, we've had a P5 process going on. And in that P5 process, we worked on a nuclear glossary. I got to tell you, I was pretty upset, again, when I was an official, when I was the undersecretary, because our arms control friends, our arms control community discarded the nuclear glossary and said, this is a nothing burger. It's not worth anything. The P5 is not doing anything. They're spinning their wheels. I said, wait a minute, guys, wait a minute. I said, the foundation stone of any nuclear arms control treaty and the negotiation leading to it is agreed definitions. If we can't agree on definitions, we cannot get to an arms control treaty. So think about this nuclear glossary project as one building block for a future negotiation. And I've actually been glad the Chinese have been very interested in pursuing further nuclear glossary work in the P5. And during their chairmanship, they have tried to push it forward. It's been the Russians who have been standing in the way because of their bloody-mindedness at the moment. But I think there are some other things we try to do in the P5 setting that were not so successful. We in the United States, UK and France, for example, were willing to invite the rest of the P5, Russia and China, to some of our sensitive nuclear sites, to the National national security site, former test site in the Nevada desert. And we even took them down the hole and showed them some of the experimental containers and that kind of thing. And the UK did the same, and the French did the same. Different transparency visits. The French took us to their nuclear submarine base, for example. But we were willing to show them things like that. And at the time, again, it was 15 years ago, they were holding us at arm's length and not willing to reciprocate. But I do think we need to continue to try to show them that we're completely transparent. As you say, Peter, it's in the congressional record, and it doesn't make us nervous at all. Of course, we take the steps we need to take to safeguard any secret facilities or secret objects if we take them to visit a facility, but we're willing to do so. And so we need to try to press that matter as well.
Finally, I would like to, before I turn it over to Kimberly, I just want to make a note that Stephen Young reminded us that in a December 2024 publication from the Department of Defense, they said China's going to have 1,500 warheads by 2035. They took that down, so to speak, and said 1,000 by 2030, and then they say growing through 2035, which is interesting that Rick Fisher, Chris Yaw, and Mark Schneider all think the Chinese are in fact going to grow through 2035, and their numbers are considerably greater than 1,500 that they project. Chris is kind of in the middle, and Rick and Mark are a little higher, but it's interesting that that the December 2024 report changed that, but since then there have been changes as well. So I'm going to thank you, Rose, for an extraordinary. It's going to be interesting to read the transcript of this, because there's a lot there to look at. Part of what I want to do is put together a list of arms control things to do and to think about, and to pass that around to folks as part of my weekly nuclear report. So I first want to say to Jim Petrosky, our president, if he has another question for Rose, please do. And then I'll turn it over to Kimberly, who's going to talk about our upcoming schedule and some things that NIDS is doing. And again, on behalf of our organization, Rose, this is really, really well done. A lot of very interesting ideas. And arms control can be a great adjunct to nuclear modernization and deterrence. And it has been since basically 1972. So anyway, or 1969 if you talk about the NPT. So anyway, thank you, and back to you, Kimberly.
Well, could I just have one quick word before?
Yes, of course.
Before I give up the floor, and thank you to everybody for some really great questions and some really great discussions. I am interested in what people think about this missile defense issue that I raised, and so if people would like to get in touch with me separately in order to give me your views on it, I'd appreciate it. I'm at Gottemoeller@stanford.edu. So that's number one. Number two, I'm not going to get into the debate. I've seen Mark Snyder's stuff, and thank you, Stephen Young, for bringing up this matter. I think, again, we just need to consider, is anybody saying they're going to get to 4,000 by 2035? I don't think so. And so, again, we can have some confidence in our ability to be prepared for that worst case. And meanwhile, we have to get those new delivery vehicles in place and make them rapidly uploadable. That's my core point.
I agree.
We have some time to work this problem. Let's not panic. And in the meantime, let's see if an arms control process can turn the Chinese away from rushing to parity. That's all I'm saying. And I think that, as always, diplomacy is the flip side of military action, right? And the two work together. So I'm not saying one excludes the other by any means. So let's think about it in that way too, that these are tools that work together.
Sure. So thank you, Rose. Kimberly, over to you.
Good. We have such a large lineup of speakers from now all the way until October. We are booked most Fridays at the same time with our Huessy events. I wanted to say a special thank you to Rose for helping us bring these important topics to a broader audience. And if you're new to NIDS, we're a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to advancing peace and promoting stability through a strong national security and nuclear deterrent. We do this by offering these type of educational opportunities like you attended today. We also do podcasts, publications, workshops, and courses through our NIDS Academy. Looking ahead, the next event we have July 18th, as Peter mentioned, is with Henry Sokolsky. After Iran, what will policing nonproliferation require? That's going to be a great event, so make sure you're on the RSVP list for that. August 1st, we have Ambassador Eric Edelman and Honorable Frank Miller will be joining us on why renewing the U.S.-Russian arms control framework is no longer sufficient in today's multipolar nuclear environment. We have our Truman event on August 6th. As the world marks the 80th anniversary of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we invite everyone in that area to come to the Harry S. Truman Library in Independence, Missouri for a one-day conference that we're doing. It's called Peace Through Strength 80 Years Later. You can find that registration on our website. We do have a full lineup, and I won't go through the entire list, but if you or your colleagues would like to get on our mailing list to receive invitations to these events, we would love to have you. Just email us at nids@thinkdeterrence.com. And we'd love to have you help us grow our community by following us on LinkedIn, X, Rumble, YouTube, and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and to keep you informed. So we thank you again for joining us, and we will take the questions that weren't answered and make sure to forward those to Rose in case she wants to address any of them individually. This transcript and a recording of this event will be on YouTube beginning next week, so feel free to email me if you need a copy of that transcript. And we hope you have a peaceful day. Thanks for being here.
And thank you, Rose. Appreciate it. My best to everybody at Stanford. And thank you, Kimberly. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all. Enjoyed being here. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rose.